Test, test. Okay. So, welcome back for the rest of the afternoon. My name is Anna. I'll be emceeing the rest of the talks. Our next speaker is Alison Gopnik, and she'll be speaking on the child as a monster, the monster as a child. Alison is a professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She is an internationally recognized leader in the study of children's learning and is the author of over 100 articles and several books, including the bestsellers The Scientist in the Crib and The Philosophical Baby: What Children's Minds Tell Us About Love, Truth, and the Meaning of Life. Please welcome Alison.
Thank you. Okay. It's working. So when Piero invited me to come and talk on this general topic of monsters, a sort of obvious thought came from having a 2-year-old grandson, which is that on a fairly regular basis, when his mom comes home after we babysat, she says, "How was Atticus?" And I say, "Eddie was a monster today." And we sort of take for granted that an incredibly cute monster, but he really was a monster. He was, last night I was taking care of him, he was all over the place. He was pushing his brother. He was literally climbing the walls. He was going crazy in all sorts of complicated ways. And you just sort of take it for granted that 2-year-olds are kind of monsters. They don't look like grown-ups. And if you look at the history of scientific thought about children, a very common way of thinking about children is to think about children in the light of the adults that they're going to become. So we often treat children as if they were sort of defective grown-ups. They're grown-ups missing a bit. And when we think about children, we think about why is it that they're not like us? Why are they so crazy? Why are they so all over the place? Why are they so unpredictable? And what I want to argue is that the very strange, monstrous, unpredictable alien things about children are actually what makes children so important. So instead of thinking about children as being kind of defective grown-ups, instead of thinking about how can we make them more like adults, we should really think of them as being really a whole separate phase, a whole separate species, a whole different kind of creature than the normal, regular humans are. And in that sense, being rather like the famous monster. And people have pointed out, of course, that at the time that Mary Shelley was writing the famous Frankenstein monster, she was actually pregnant and was thinking about children and our relationship to children. So the core of the argument that I want to make really depends on a lovely idea in evolutionary biology called life history. So imagine an evolutionary biologist from Alpha Centauri who arrived on the Earth 150,000 years ago and was looking around at all these little creatures, these mammals of various sorts who were scampering around on the veldt. And suppose she wanted to say, what makes this one newly evolved creature really different from all the other creatures? At that stage in human history, things like culture or technology or education, you wouldn't have seen differences between us and, say, the proto-chimpanzees at that stage in our history. But one thing that would have absolutely leapt out at that Alpha Centauran biologist is that human beings have such a peculiar life history. And life history is about the way that an organism develops over time. So it includes things like how long a period of immaturity do we have? How much do we invest and take care of our children? How long do we live? Do we live past menopause, for example? Those are all features of a species and organism's life history. And what she would have said is these creatures have a very bizarre, weird, counterintuitive life history. Because what you would have noticed is that our children, are immature, dependent on us for much longer, twice as long as the young of any other species. So this is a 7-year-old chimp in the Gombe. Chimps are our closest living relatives. And by the time this chimp is 7, he will actually be producing as much food as he's consuming. So he's already self-sufficient by the time that he's 7. Even if you look in forager hunter-gatherer societies, children aren't, that's not true until at least 15. That's kind of the youngest age when you start seeing children be self-sufficient. And my son is 30, and in our culture, even 30-year-olds are still cashing rent checks and tuition checks. Uh, uh, and in addition to this extended long period of immaturity, this extended period of investment, in the same rather brief period when we evolved that really distinctive life history, we also evolved a whole lot of other adaptations for dealing with these hopeful monsters, with these blood-sucking young members of our species. Um, uh, and I think of this as being kind of the parental investment triple threat. So, for example, only we're one of very few species, only 5% of all mammals and none of our closest primate relatives who have pair bonding, so that we have males and females who are both involved and engaged in taking care of children and who are attached to one another as well. That's actually, we take that for granted, but that's actually a very unusual structure in biology. And we seem to have developed it quite quickly in the period when we became human. We have what the great anthropologist Sarah Hardy calls alloparents. So we actually have other people, non-biological kin, who are involved in taking care of babies and young children. There was a study that came out recently in a forager culture looking at how many people breastfeed your average baby. And it turns out that in the course of a week, the baby in these cultures is breastfed by 4 different women. So not just, kind of having babysitters, but really serious shared care for the young. And again, this is not true for any of our closest primate relatives, although it is true for other animals in other evolutionary niches. And we also have my own personal favorite. We have grandmothers. So if you look behind those 3 beautiful children, that's the baby is Addie the monster, who now is 2 and gets around even more and is even prettier and even more trouble than he was then. So we have females who are continuing to live past their fertility. And again, if you think about that from an evolutionary perspective, that's extremely puzzling. Why would you have women continuing to be around for 10 or 20 years after they're no longer fertile? And that's not just true in contemporary society, that's true in forager cultures too. And it really makes us very distinct from, again, our closest chimpanzee relatives, where chimpanzee females die when they're about 50, about the same age that they're no longer fertile. So we seem to have both extended our childhood at one end and extended our adulthood into this kind of period of old age. And at least one hypothesis is that the reason why we did that was because those elders now were deeply involved in taking care of those immature young. So there seems to be a kind of combination of having the longer immature young and then also having people at the end, getting closer to the ends of their lives who are involved in investing in taking care of those young. In fact, killer whales are the only other animal that we know of that has menopause, where females are living past fertility. And an interesting thing to note is that killer whales are also one of the few species we know of that has culture, that actually transmits information from one generation to the next. And that seems to be another kind of function that those grandmothers and grandfathers are serving from an evolutionary perspective. So the puzzle is, from an evolutionary perspective, we have these children who are useless, increasingly useless, and we have all this work, all these adaptations, all these people in the adult society who are putting in so much time and energy just to keep those children alive. And the puzzle from an evolutionary perspective is, why would you use this design? Why would you design a creature this way when you could be a creature like ducklings, where the babies are born and then they're functional very soon after they're born? Well, it turns out that if you look across many, many, many different kinds of animals, you see this really striking relationship between an early period of immaturity and lots of investment from elders, and brings us brain size in general and learning as well as brain size. So for example, these are marsupials. So these are animals who are grow their babies in pouches instead of inside of their wombs. And a lovely study looked at 150 different species of marsupials. And you discover that among the marsupials, this one, for example, is this adorable animal called the quokka that lives in Australia. And the quokka is about the same size as this animal. This is a Virginia opossum, but they have very different life histories. So the quokka only has 1 or 2 babies at a time. Both the males and the females take care of the babies, so there's this pair bonding. And the babies stay in the pouch for as long as a year. In contrast, the Virginia opossum has many babies all at once. Only the mother, the biological mother, is involved in caring for the babies, and the babies are mature and independent much more quickly, within a few months. Now, for humans, I think we often feel more like the possum than we feel like the quokkas. We could all use more backlighting in our lives. But in fact, when you look at brain size, the quokka's brain is twice as large as the possum's brain, even though they're the same, even though they have the same body size. So it looks as if there's something going on, some relationship between brain size and a reliance on learning and this extended period of immaturity and big parental investment. And you can see this not only in mammals like us, but you can also see this in birds. In fact, this was one of the first places where people saw this relationship. So for example, if you compare this crow, this is a New Caledonian crow, and crows and corvids and ravens in general are very, very smart animals. These New Caledonian crows are exceptionally smart, as smart, if not smarter than chimpanzees. This is a crow who's learned how to bend a piece of wire to get food. And you can contrast those very, very smart, flexible animals with animals like our friend the domestic chicken. And with apologies to chicken lovers in the audience, I understand that down here in the valley, basically while you're checking your IPO, you're also checking to see how your chickens are doing. But chickens are basically dumb as stumps, so don't ask the chicken about the IPO. They're very, very, another way of putting it is they're very, very good at pecking for grain. They're not much good at doing anything else. So there's, and when you look at development, what you see is that the chicks are mature within weeks or months, and the crow babies are fledglings for as long as a year. And in the case of the New Caledonian crows, they're fledglings for as long as 2 years, which is a very long time in the life of a bird. So you seem to have these two really different evolutionary strategies. One of them, which is the chicken strategy, is be very, very good at doing one thing in particular. Have a brain that's just beautifully designed to peck grain very effectively. And have that brain in place from the time that you're born. That's essentially the chicken strategy. The other strategy, the crow strategy, is don't have anything particularly in place to begin with, but have lots of flexibility, have lots of opportunities to learn. And on top of that, have this period of childhood, have this early time when you're actually designed to learn, when everything about you is really designed to allow this really extensive learning about the environment that you're in. And again, we human beings are way off on the end of the distribution. We have the largest brain, we rely the most on learning, and we have the longest, drastically longest period of immaturity. Why would you see this relationship? Well, if you actually look at what the New Caledonian crows are doing, you can get some hints. What's going on during this period of immaturity? Well, it turns out that, for example, in the wild, these animals use their tool-using abilities to do things like this. They'll take a pandanus palm leaf, they'll strip the bottom leaves off of the palm, so there's little barbs left. They'll nibble the end to a sharp point, and they'll take it by the fat end in their beaks. They'll find a termite hole, and then they'll turn it around until they stir up the termites, and then they'll pull it out, and they'll get a termite shish kebab as a result of doing this. This is an incredible, amazing thing. But perhaps even more amazing is the fact that they actually have to learn how to do this. And what's happening in that 2 years when they're a fledgling is that, again, as we'd say down in the valley, they fail further and fail faster. So essentially what the babies are doing is screwing this up. They're trying it by the thin end instead of by the fat end. They put it in a hole that doesn't have any termites in. They take the barbs off the top instead of the bottom. They do this elaborate process of trial and error, which mostly involves failure, very occasionally involves success. And they can afford to do that because they have a mother who's sort of sitting there tapping her foot and dropping termites into their mouths. One way I put this sometimes is you could think about the young as being the R&D division of a species, and then the old as being production and marketing. So they get this period in which all they have to do is learn. All they have to do is figure out the world around them. And again, this seems to be a very general biological principle. So you see it with crows and chickens in a study that I really love, a recent study. You even see it with butterflies. So this is a study that looked at cabbage white butterflies. And it turns out that most cabbage white butterflies are just innately designed to go to green food. They live on kale. So they just see kale, they go to the kale, they lay their eggs on the kale. But there's a subset who can actually do something that doesn't qualify as very high intelligence from our perspective, but is pretty sophisticated for a butterfly, which is that they flitter around, try lots of different kinds of leaves, lots of different kinds of plants, and they actually experiment until they find one that actually is a good food source, and then they lay their eggs on the one that's the good food source. So you have one strategy which is just built in, go for the kale, put your eggs on the kale, and then you have this other strategy which is look around and see, maybe there's something that's even better to eat than kale. And it turns out that the young of the smarter butterflies actually are immature for twice as long as the young of the dumber butterflies, in spite of the fact that we're only talking now about days and weeks. So even for butterflies, there seems to be this relationship between how much are you relying on this exploratory learning strategy versus how much are you relying on this innate strategy and having this period of immaturity, which is the thing that actually lets you implement that strategy. And we can see this development even if we look at neuroscience. So one of the things that we can see is that when we actually look at human fossils, you can see this period of extended immaturity happening even in the very course of human evolution itself if you do things like look at fossil teeth. So fossil teeth can tell you something about how long a period of maturity or immaturity an animal has. When you look at teeth, even compared to Neanderthals, early humans seem to have had this longer period of childhood. Now, kind of to get back to the monstrosity a little bit, when we look at cognitive science, which is my field, you see something really interesting, which is that if you're thinking about something like intelligence, it looks as if there's a really different kind of intelligence that we have as adults and that we have as children. So, for example, when I'm collaborating with people who are doing things in AI, one of the really interesting questions when you're thinking about artificial intelligence is, what kind of intelligence are you talking about? And when you're thinking about adult intelligence, the kind of intelligence that you're talking about is things like attention, being able to focus on one thing at a time, being able to plan over a long term, being able to make good decisions, being able to defer gratification, being able to ignore distractions. Those are all the things that we think of as being part of adult intelligence. And again, here's where the monsters come in. 2-year-olds are incredibly bad at doing all of that, right? So 2-year-olds make awful decisions. They're terrible at planning. They can't resist impulses. They climb the walls. They're noisy. They're all over the place. But on the other hand, when you look at the kind of intelligence that's involved in wide-ranging learning, that's where you seem to see incredible capacities in children. So if you look at childhood cognitive development, the kinds of things that we study and that we've discovered is that even very young children, for instance, are learning statistics. So they can look at a pattern of probability and infer statistics. They are figuring out the grammar of a language spontaneously. They're making up everyday theories about how the other people around them work and how the biological world works, how the physical world works. And their ideas change rapidly and swiftly and impressively compared to the kind of change that we see even in the greatest and smartest adult scientists. So again, the picture is not that the children are just defective grown-ups. It's just that they can't do all these grown-up things. There seems to be this real trade-off, which is that they can't do the grown-up things, but they're incredibly good at doing these other kinds of things. They're bad at planning. They're good at learning. They're bad at acting. They're good at taking in information. Um, and again, you can see this even when you look at brains. So this is a famous slide that shows the development of the number of synapses, the number of connections between one neuron and another over time. And again, if you looked at this slide, what you might think is, well, wait a minute, like there's two different creatures here. There's one creature with a brain that's making many, many, many new connections all the time, but in which none of those connections are very strong or very efficient or very effective. And then there's a tipping point, and you end up with a different brain, an adult brain. The adult brain prunes, gets rid of a lot of the connections that aren't exercised. Then it takes the connections that are left and makes them swift and efficient and effective, but not very flexible, not very good at changing. So you really seem to have two different creatures with two different brains when you're talking about children and adults. You have the children who have a brain that's wonderfully designed for flexibility, wonderfully designed to take in information, find out things about the world around them, not very well designed for acting. And then you have a grown-up brain that's very well designed for acting, not very good at considering new possibilities, being flexible, finding out things, getting more information about the world. And this is one of my favorite recent studies. You can even see this again if you're looking at brains in terms of how active the brain is. So this is a slide that actually reflects the fact that as you're just sitting here now, some of you anyway, about 20% of your calories are going to your brain. I always think if you're thinking deep thoughts, it should be more, but it turns out that's not really true. Just as you're sitting here, 20% of your calories are going to brain. Brains are, expensive computing gadgets. They're kind of like Macs. So that already seems like a pretty expensive computing gadget for something that's just sitting there doing nothing. But I think we've actually got maybe some 5- and 6-year-olds in the house. When you were 5, 66% of your calories were going to your brains. So as I say, some among you have brains that are much more active, that are using up much more glucose, that are doing more than the brains of the other people, the other older people sitting in this room. I like this also, thinking of monsters, as a kind of vision of my 4-year-old granddaughter. Basically, she's this giant, hungry brain that's attached to this little tiny, skinny body, kind of like a Doctor Who villains always look like this giant, hungry brain, little skinny body, goes around the world hypnotizing us all into becoming her slaves and feeding her hungry brain. That's a pretty good description of what Georgiana is like. So that high energy that we see with very young children is not just high energy in terms of their going around the world, it's also high energy going into their brains. So why would we see this striking relationship? Well, when you go and talk to people in computer science, they talk about this interesting contrast between different ways that you could solve a problem. And the words that people use often are a contrast between exploitation and exploration. The idea, you can think about the idea like this. Imagine that you're trying to solve some problem. And imagine as if there's a big box full of solutions to the problem. And you're at one place in this box at this moment. So you've got the thing that you think is the most likely solution now. How are you going to try and see if there's a better solution? Well, one thing you can do is you can search very close to the place where you already are. So you can just make little changes to what you already think and try and find something that will be a bit better than the solution that you're already thinking about. And that's what people call a low temperature search. So the idea is like a cool molecule, that will be good at getting to a kind of obvious solution, but there might be a really much better solution much further away in the space, much more different from the thing that you already think. And if you just make these little local changes, you're not going to get to that other and better solution. On the other hand, what you can do is you can in this case, literally bounce around the space. You could move from one idea to another idea really quickly and be willing to move very far away from the place that you currently are. Think about crazy things, things that don't make any sense, things that seem totally bizarre and weird. The disadvantage of that is you're much less likely to get to a reasonable, decent solution quickly. You're going to spend a lot of your time out in this space of ideas that don't do you any good at all. But it means that you're likely to find the solution that's the really good solution that in this case is not outside of the box, but at least far away in the far corners of the box. And there's an intrinsic tension between those two kinds of strategies for solving problems. There isn't any way that you can ideally say this is the temperature you ought to search at. You're always going to have these trade-offs, these exploitation and exploration trade-offs. And the way that people solve this in computer science, for example, is often with something called simulated annealing. So the idea is, it turns out a good way of trying to solve this problem is start out with a very bouncy high temperature search. Start out trying all sorts of things, and then gradually cool down to work out the details of something that will actually work and that will be stable. Here's an example of a very simple version of this. So suppose I'm just trying to get to the highest peak, the measure in this graph, and I start out in the middle. Get my pointer. Yeah, so suppose I start out here, and it turns out that that is actually a pretty good solution compared to all the solutions that are nearby. So if I just search around here, I'm not going to move over to here, which is where the really great solution is, the much better solution is. But to get over here, I'm going to have to first try solutions that are actually much worse than the solution that I currently have. And the annealing solution is to start out, sorry, is this working? Yeah, is to start out looking all over the place, and then find this, sorry, let me do this again. And then eventually to find the solution that's actually the best solution. So our slogan is that you could think about childhood as being evolution's way of doing simulated annealing. We have this early, I think if I asked anybody who has a 4-year-old, what's a better description of your child? This low temperature person who sits and just does little tiny changes in what they already believe and think, or this high temperature person who's bouncing around both literally and figuratively all the time? I think everyone would say, yeah, that second one, that sounds much more like a 2-year-old. And we've actually done a bunch of studies which show that this is actually true, that if you give people a problem that's where the solution is pretty obvious, then grown-ups are always going to beat kids at those kinds of problems. But you can find problems where the solution's kind of unusual, unlikely to begin with. And at least sometimes the children are actually better at solving those problems than the grown-ups are. And we've shown this, and other people have shown this for quite a wide range of different problems. So the idea is that some of the things that we think of as monstrous bugs, things that we think of as real problems or defects or deficits about childhood, may actually be features if you're thinking about this kind of high temperature search and explore-exploit trade-off. So for example, one of the things that we know about babies and young children is that they're noisy, again, both literally and figuratively. They're noisy in the sense they make a lot of noise, but they're also noisy in the sense that they do a lot of random, very variable kinds of behaviors. So even if you look at, if you were to do a little track of my 2-year-old Addie's movements through the room, what you'd see is that instead of just going any place in a straight line, what he's going to do is randomly move around to lots of different places at once. And we can show that that's not just true about the way that he walks across the room, it's true about how his brain works, and it's true about how his mind works. Again, traditionally people thought of that as being a drawback. They thought of that as being a bug, something that was kind of monstrous. But if you're thinking about this exploratory strategy, introducing a lot of randomness and variability and noise actually might be a good thing. One of the things that people often talk about is that young children don't have as much frontal control. So they're part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex, that functions like a kind of executive, central executive office, doesn't seem to work as well or lead to as much control as it does for adults. And we typically think about that as being a problem. But again, those same executive function deficits, those inabilities to control and inhibit and focus, the things that make the kids seem like alien monsters, may actually be real advantages if you're thinking about this high temperature exploration strategy. Because what executive function does is exactly keep you from doing the things that aren't going to be immediately effective or efficient. One of the things that we know that children do very characteristically is play. And again, this isn't just true about human children. This is true about the young of all species. It's characteristic that play is what young animals do rather than old animals. And play itself involves some of the same paradoxes as childhood does. So the whole definition of play is something you do that doesn't seem to have any function, that doesn't seem to actually get you where you want to go. That's what it means to have play. But again, if you're thinking about this contrast between exploration and exploitation, between a brain that's designed to learn and a brain that's designed to act and make things happen, then play, it turns out, is a really good exploration strategy. Whether it's the kind of physical play that you see a 9-month-old do, or the kind of pretend play that you see a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old do. What play is all about is exploring low probability options, thinking about things that aren't actually very likely to begin with. Another interesting difference between these kind of alien monsters that we call children and adults is that the children seem to have this intrinsic, what you might technically call epistemic motivation. In other words, you want to know what drives a 4-year-old. What drives a 4-year-old is finding out things that are new, figuring out things that are going on around them. They're not very sensitive to reward, and we've actually done a recent study where we gave children and adults 2 boxes to choose. One box, and both the boxes have little plastic eggs, the kind you get at Easter. And each box has 6 blue eggs and 6 red eggs. What we tell you is for one of these boxes, there's a sticker in every single one of these eggs. In the other one, only half of the eggs have stickers. You get to choose which, and there's a clue that will tell you which half have stickers. You get to choose which box you want, and you get to keep all the stickers. Now, for adults, like the M-Turkers that we've studied, this is kind of a no-brainer, right? Like, you definitely should choose the box that you know has 12 stickers instead of the one that has 6. But of course, the 6-sticker box is going to teach you something. There's actually something to learn about that box. And what we've discovered is that although the grown-ups always choose the one with the more reward, 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds will actually choose the one that lets them learn more, that's more informative. And there's a bunch of other studies that suggest this as well. So again, big difference in very basic motivational structure between the people that we all know around us, the grown-ups who go out and try and maximize their rewards, and these children who don't seem to care so much about rewards, but are very, very interested in extracting information and finding out more about the world around them. And remember, by the way, that they can only afford to do this because they have those mothers and fathers and grandmothers and alloparents taking care of them. And as I mentioned, we've done these studies in my own lab that I talked about in a previous laser, where we've actually shown that children are better at coming up with these unlikely solutions than adults are. And that's true, by the way, for very low-income children living in Peru and children in Head Start programs as much as for the children in a middle-class daycare. And in fact, there's some other evidence from neuroscience which suggests that in fact, having less frontal control leads to more exploration. And I won't go into all the details, but there's even studies that show that if you zap your frontal lobes, you do better on divergent thinking, creativity kinds of tests. So in effect, by turning yourself into one of those, something a bit more like one of those childhood monsters, you do terribly on almost any other measure. You're going to do much worse at any structured, goal-directed task. The one thing that you might do better is actually come up with creative new solutions to problems. And then just the last thing that I'll say, if you think 2-year-olds are, if you find yourself saying, my 2-year-old is a monster, you're perhaps even more likely to say that about your 14-year-old. And one of the things that we've been doing in our lab most recently is demonstrating that adolescents actually show some of the same kinds of characteristics as 4-year-olds do. But they do this in a social setting. And there's neuroscience that suggests this as well. So if you actually look at the curve, the preschoolers are up at the top in terms of exploration, creativity, and innovation. Sad fact is that we fall off when we go to school. But then there's this real kind of rebirth of plasticity and open-mindedness and flexibility, both in the brain and in behavior when we reach adolescence, which again trails off as we become adults. But we only see that for social problems. We don't see that for understanding the physical world, but we do see it if we ask questions like, why did someone do the thing they did? Adolescents are much more creative in answering a question like that than adults are. So it may be that, again, just as the preschoolers are, simultaneously brilliant and engaging and infuriating and crazy and monstrous, the same thing may well be true about adolescents, except the adolescents aren't quite as cute, so we don't tolerate it as well as we do with the little ones. So let me just put up a slide talking about my collaborators and some of the support that's happened for some of this work. So what's the moral? The moral, which I think is the moral of Mary Shelley's book as well, is that there's much to be said for monsters, that actually having people in the world who don't have all the same assumptions that we do, who don't know all the same things that we do, that aren't capable and competent in all the ways that we are as adults, actually gives us advantages. It enables us to figure out new possibilities, to think about the world in new ways. In fact, in some of the sort of romantic, capital R romantic ways that Mary Shelley talked about. So we actually have those Frankensteins, those monsters, those creative, romantic, crazy, infuriating monsters around us. We just call them our children. Okay, so let me stop there and take some questions.
We have some time for questions.
Are there any women with questions? Yeah, thanks. I've discovered that when I give talks, even though I'm talking about kids and there's mostly women in the audience, for some reason the first questions tend to be.
I was curious about the gestational time and the child rearing time for dolphins.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story. In general, so if you look at dolphins, for example, they've got a longer life history than, say, fish do. But there's an interesting contrast. The killer whales are interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think of killer whales right off as being an especially smart species. But it turns out that if you look at this particular dimension of intelligence, which is, do you pass on cultural information? The killer whales actually do much more of that than the dolphins do. So the dolphins are good at using tools, and they do have a relatively larger brain and a relatively larger gestation period. But it turns out that the particular kind of intelligence about being able to learn from your elders, that really seems to be the one that's particularly related with this long life history.
You said that once kids start going to school, they sort of drop down in their creativity. What happens if children don't go to school, or if they grow up in areas where...
Yeah, we don't know how much of this is the result of a consequence of going to school, or how much of it is that we send kids to school, because that's about the time when they're able to do things like be focused, pay attention, solve a particular task. They wouldn't, those are all things that you do, in fact, have to do in school. And I want to emphasize that obviously, you know, my heart is with the little monsters, but in fact, you wouldn't want to have a world that was ruled and run by 4-year-olds. There's lots to be said for, which, by the way, I should point out, I wrote a column about it. It's not referring to the world we have now. If the world we could do better with a lot of 4-year-old characteristics. But I think it's important to say that this exploration-exploitation trade-off, even though, especially around here, we all love the exploration side, that's really a trade-off. So if we really want to have adults who are capable of doing the things we need to be able to get the resources we have so that we can support those children, we need to have people who do have focus and planning and so forth. And that seems to be the role that the school-age period for both schooled and unschooled people really, really plays. So even if you look in places where you don't have school, things like apprenticeships, for instance, start happening around with, you know, when you're around 7 or 8. So that seems to be a time when you're starting to make this transition from this early exploration to later exploitation period. But we're not sure how much of that is just maturational and how much of it might just be the function of going to school. Yeah.
If you were to look back several years when the average age was expected to be about 40, and you look at us now and the average age probably 70, and you project it ahead to when the average age is going to be over 100, if you were to draw your graphs again, would you assume that those peaks and valleys would look pretty much alike because we just extended the period of time, or would you expect something new to develop?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it turns out that interestingly, although, you know, when people say things like, well, the expected age was 40, the reason for that is because you have lots of children who are dying very young. So if you look at a forager culture and you say, if you make it past 40, how old are you going to live? It turns out that that's not that different from the current trajectory. So it's a little different. So you probably would live to be 70 or 80, but there are lots of 80-year-old women among forager cultures. It's not people who are 100, but lots of 80-year-olds. So the real difference in life expectancy is not about how long do you live total. It's about how long, whether you survive in the early period or not. Now, there is an interesting cultural question. It does seem as if when you have culture that can support an earlier period of immaturity, you get longer periods of immaturity. And it's an interesting, you know, it goes back to the 30-year-olds. It's an interesting question about whether that's already been extended in a highly resource-dependent kind of culture like ours. One thing that I think is really interesting that we're just starting to look at is, are there also brain changes, say, about 50, this period where there's this transition to grandmotherhood? It's very easy to see for women, but similar transitions are happening for men. And there might be some of these cognitive changes that, again, mean that you get more creativity, more possibility. You have a different kind of brain when you're a grandmother than when you're a mother than when you're a child. And I actually like this idea too. The grandmothers there might be a reason why the grandparents and the children always seem to get along better than the intermediate generation. Yeah.
There's this interesting observation that if we compare results of IQ tests from the 1930s to now, it looks like average IQ is going up. Is that a real phenomenon?
Yeah, that does look like a real, I think it is a real phenomenon. There was an interesting big review paper that I just saw about it. And of course, part of the puzzle is what's the things that those IQ tests are measuring. But certainly, all the argument is that that period of education, again, extending that period of exploration and learning, which is what we do by, say, having universities, might be connected to that increase in IQ, which does seem to be a genuine, real phenomenon.
One more question.
Yeah, why don't we get one of the people with those 66% brains, guy?
Does play differ on age, or does it stay the same through age?
Play?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So In general, when you look across different species, what you see is there's more play in the young than there is in the old. But when you look at our species, what you see is the kind of play that children are engaging in seems to shift as they get older in ways that reflect the kind of problems they're trying to solve. So if you look at babies, like a 9-month-old, their idea of playing is taking the rattle and putting it in their mouths and then putting it somewhere else and then shaking it and trying something else. If you look at a 3-year-old, their idea of play is being off in this crazy pretend world with imaginary companions. If you look at a 7 or 8-year-old, they start doing something that's fascinating called creating paracosms. So 8-year-olds, instead of just pretending that, they're Batman or something, will actually create these alternative universes. So they'll make up worlds, like the kind of worlds that the Brontes created, for example. But this isn't just brilliant authors. It seems to be very common among 7 and 8-year-olds. And they start doing things like playing games with rules. So they start doing things like building tree houses together, or figuring out how to play, even more than playing a game that already has rules, figuring out new rules for new games, like Foursquare or Wall Ball. And the story seems to be that when you get to be in middle childhood, 7 or 8, the agenda is, as I said about the adolescents, is really about figure out how the society around you works. Figure out how you could get along well with other people, as opposed to the babies who are trying to figure out how rattles work. But the principle, play around, try different options, don't worry about whether things are going to go well or not, that seems to be the same. Okay.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run
Thank
out of
you.
time. Super interesting topic.